Ever had one of those days? You know, the kind where you spill your ridiculously expensive coffee all over your white shirt, you get stuck in traffic for an hour, your boss yells at you for something that wasn't your fault, and then you get home and your Wi-Fi is down. You throw yourself onto the couch and think, this is it. This is the worst day ever. It literally cannot get any worse. Well, I'm here to tell you that about 1,000 years ago, an entire class of people, like 90% of the population, would have looked at your terrible, no good day and probably traded their entire life for it in a heartbeat. I'm talking, of course, about medieval peasants. When we think of the Middle Ages, our minds usually jump to the cool stuff, right? We picture towering castles with flags flapping in the wind, knights in shining armor riding off to glorious tournaments, maybe a few princesses, and if you're feeling spicy, a dragon or two. It's all very Game of Thrones, minus the, well, you know. But here's the reality check. For the vast majority of people, life wasn't a fantasy epic. It was a grind. An endless, backbreaking, muddy, and often very smelly grind. These were the regular folks, the common people, and their lives were so challenging, so utterly different from ours, that it's almost impossible to wrap our modern brains around it. Let's just start with the absolute basics. Forget smartphones, forget cars, forget the internet. Imagine living in a world with zero electricity. That means when the sun goes down, especially in the dead of winter at like 4:30 p.m., your world becomes pitch black. Your only light might be a flickering, smoky fire in the middle of your one-room hut, or maybe, if you were doing okay, a rushlight, which is basically just a reed dipped in animal fat. It gave off about as much light as a single birthday candle. Try reading, or fixing a tool, or, God forbid, scrolling through social media by that light. And how about no running water? You couldn't just turn on a tap to get a drink, take a shower, or flush a toilet, because those definitely didn't exist. Every single drop of water you used for drinking, cooking, and washing what little washing you did had to be hauled by hand in heavy wooden buckets from the nearest well or river. And let's be honest, that river was probably the same place your neighbor dumped their night soil, and the same place the animals drank from. We'll get into what they drank instead of water later, and trust me, it's a happy hour fact you won't want to miss. Feeling tired and don't want to cook? Forget it. There's no takeout. There's no delivery app. There's no frozen pizza. Every single meal, every single day, was the result of hours of hard labor. If you wanted bread, you had to grow the wheat, harvest it, thresh it, grind it into flour, with a stone that left grit in it, and then bake it, probably in a communal oven you had to pay to use. It was just you, your family, and whatever you could personally manage to grow, raise, or trade for. These folks were, without a doubt, tougher than any CrossFit enthusiast or marathon runner you will ever meet. We're busy counting steps on our smartwatches and trying to close our rings. They were living the most extreme version of functional fitness every single day of their lives, whether they wanted to or not. Their workout started before the sun came up and didn't end until it went down. It involved lifting, carrying, digging, chopping, and walking for miles. And trust me, there was no whey protein shake or smoothie waiting for them at the end of it. Their post-workout meal was more likely a hunk of dark, gritty bread and a bowl of thin vegetable soup they called pottage. But here's the thing that might surprise you. Despite living what we would consider a pretty miserable existence, medieval peasants weren't just sitting around in the mud feeling sorry for themselves. They were incredibly resilient. They built tight-knit communities because they literally had to. You couldn't survive alone. They created their own fun, their own festivals, their own music. They probably had a richer and more connected social life than most of us do today, spending our evenings staring at glowing rectangles. I mean, seriously, when was the last time your entire neighborhood, every single person got together for a massive, multi-day feast and party? And no, ordering from the same pizza place on a Friday night does not count. When your neighbor's ox died, you lent them yours, because you knew that next year, when your barn roof caved in, they'd be the first ones over with a hammer and a bundle of straw. It was a level of community that we have almost completely lost. Life wasn't easy, but these people were resourceful to a degree that is just staggering. They had to be. When you're living in a world without convenience stores, online shopping, or even a basic hardware store, you learn to make, fix, or make do with whatever you have. It was like living in extreme survival mode, but instead of it being a 30-day TV show challenge, this was their entire life, from the day they were born to the day they died. So now that we've kind of set the stage, now that we've established just how unbelievably tough the baseline for normal life was for a medieval peasant, I want to talk about what they actually did all day. Because if you think their living conditions were rough, wait until you hear about their job, or more accurately, their jobs, plural. Because a peasant had to be a master of everything. And their day? It kicked off before sunrise, which in the middle of winter wasn't too terrible, maybe around 7 a.m. But in the summer, we're talking 4 a.m. wake-up calls. And you thought your 6 a.m. alarm for the gym was brutal. A medieval peasant's work schedule would make the most demanding modern jobs look like a part-time vacation. A medieval peasant's work schedule wasn't just tough. It would make the most grueling, high-pressure modern job look like a relaxing spa day. You know how we have specialists for everything? You have a plumber for your pipes, an electrician for your lights, a mechanic for your car, and a farmer who grows your food. Well, the medieval peasant didn't have that luxury. They didn't just have one job. They had to be farmers, carpenters, shepherds, blacksmiths, roofers, and veterinarians, all rolled into one. You know that saying, jack of all trades, master of none? These folks invented it. Except they kind of had to be masters of all of them, because if they didn't know how to do something, they couldn't just Google it or hire a guy. They had to learn, and learn fast, or they and their families would starve, freeze, or watch their homes fall down around them. Their entire life was dictated by the seasons. This wasn't a 9 to 5, Monday to Friday gig. This was a 365-day-a-year contract with Mother Nature, and she was a very strict boss. The farming year was broken down into specific, critical tasks that had to be done at exactly the right time. There were no extensions, no I'll get to it next week. You did it now, or you paid the price in winter. Let's start with spring. Spring meant one thing: ploughing. And I'm not talking about sitting in an air-conditioned, self-driving John Deere tractor with GPS and a nice stereo. We're talking about a heavy, clunky wooden plough, maybe tipped with a bit of iron if you were lucky. This thing was pulled by a team of oxen. The peasant's job, for hours and hours on end, was to walk behind this thing in the thick, cold mud, using every ounce of their strength to wrestle it, to keep the blade straight and at the exact right depth in the soil. Too shallow, and the seeds wouldn't take. Too deep, and you'd exhaust your oxen and break the plough. And let's talk about those oxen. They were the medieval equivalent of a tractor, a car, and your entire life savings all rolled into one. Fun fact for you, historians estimate it took a team of 8 oxen to plough just 1 acre of heavy clay soil in a single day. 8. Most peasant families didn't own 8 oxen. They were lucky if they owned 2, or even 1. So they'd have to team up with their neighbours, pooling their animals. This made everything a delicate communal balancing act, but it also meant that if you lost an ox, if it got sick, or old, or broke its leg, you were in catastrophic trouble. It was like totaling your car, losing your job, and having your bank account frozen all at the same time. It was a disaster. Then came summer. You'd think, okay, the ploughing's done, the seeds are in, time to chill, right? Wrong. Summer brought its own special kind of back-breaking misery. From sunrise to sunset, peasants would be bent over in the fields, weeding, and again, no fancy weed killers, no gardening tools like we have. It was just their hands, and maybe a simple, short-handled tool. Every single weed had to be pulled out by hand. Why? Because one bad patch of weeds could spread and choke out an entire section of your crop, ruining weeks of work and, more importantly, months of food. My back hurts just thinking about it. And then there were the pests. No pesticides meant you had to get creative. You were in a constant, running battle with birds, rabbits, deer, and insects, all of whom saw your field as their personal, all-you-can-eat buffet. So, what did you do? Well, some peasants would actually hire children their own, or their neighbours to just run up and down the fields all day, yelling, banging pots and pans, and generally making a racket to scare away the birds. It was basically the medieval equivalent of a summer job. Except instead of flipping burgers or lifeguarding, you were a professional crow scarer. But here's something that'll blow your mind. Amidst all this grueling labour, medieval peasants were actually brilliant innovators. They figured out, through centuries of trial and error, complex farming techniques that we still use today. They invented crop rotation way before any scientist in a lab coat could explain the chemistry behind it. They knew that if you planted the same crop in the same field year after year, say wheat, the soil would just get depleted and you'd get terrible harvests. So, they'd divide their land into 3 fields. In year 1, they'd plant wheat in the first field, barley in the second, and leave the third field completely empty. They called this fallow to let it rest and recover. The next year, they'd rotate. The wheat field would get barley, the barley field would go fallow, and the fallow field would get wheat. It was an incredibly sophisticated system for managing soil health, and they figured it out all on their own. They were the original agricultural scientists. Okay, so you survive spring and summer. Now comes fall. This was harvest time, and this is when everything kicked into overdrive. This was the medieval crunch time. It was all hands on deck. Every able-bodied person in the village, men, women, and even the older children would be out in the fields from the first hint of light until they couldn't see their own hands. They were in a desperate race against time and, more importantly, against the weather. One bad rainstorm, one hailstorm could wipe out everything they had worked for all year. They used sickles to cut the grain. A sickle is basically a short, curved blade. You had to bend over, grab a handful of grain, and swing the blade just right to cut it. Swing too high, you leave grain behind. Swing too low, you hit a rock and dull your blade, or worse, your hand. It was mind-numbing, repetitive, and incredibly dangerous. Studies of medieval skeletons show that a good, experienced harvester could cut about an acre of wheat in a day. But to do that, they had to make around 15,000 individual cuts with that sickle. 15,000. Talk about repetitive motion injury. In fact, archaeologists have found that the vast majority of medieval peasant skeletons show signs of severe, debilitating arthritis, often starting in their mid-30 seconds. No wonder. They were essentially doing high-impact, full-body CrossFit from the time they were old enough to walk. Finally, you get to winter. You'd think, yes, the harvest is in, time to hibernate, sit by the fire, and chill. Nope, not a chance. Winter wasn't downtime. It was just a different kind of work. This was when peasants had to repair literally everything that broke or wore out during the rest of the year. Tools needed new handles. Buildings and fences needed patching. Remember those wattle and daub walls we talked about? They also had to care for their animals 24/7, which meant trudging through snow and mud in the freezing dark to feed them and muck out their shelters. Plus, this was prime time for all the indoor work. Women would spend hours every single day spinning wool into thread, an incredibly slow process. They'd be making and mending clothes, making candles from animal fat. A medieval winter was basically one long, non-stop home improvement and logistics project, minus the helpful YouTube tutorials and trips to Home Depot. And don't even get me started on the joy of threshing. This meant taking all that grain you harvested and beating it with a stick, called a flail, for hours and hours and hours, on end, in a cold, dusty, poorly ventilated barn, just to separate the grain from the stalk. It sounds like the world's worst, loudest, and most boring drum circle. But here is something that's going to absolutely shock you. After all this back-breaking, sunrise to sunset, 3, 6, 5-day-a-year labor, medieval peasants actually had more vacation days than most of us do now. How is that possible? The church. The medieval church enforced numerous holy days, saints' days, festivals, religious holidays where work was absolutely forbidden. Some historians estimate that when you add it all up, peasants got around 150 days off per year. That's almost half the year. Now, off didn't mean they were flying to Ibiza, but it did mean a day off from the fields, a day for feasting, for festivals, for going to church, and for not breaking their backs. The other clever bit about medieval work was how intensely communal it was. Everyone pitched in. During the harvest, the whole village worked as one, and they developed this really complex, informal system of mutual aid. Remember that neighbour's ox that died? You'd lend them yours, without a second thought, because you knew for a fact they would do the same for you. It was like an early version of Social Security, just with more manure and way less paperwork. And this wasn't just some nice, fluffy it takes a village idea. Recent studies of medieval village records show that these informal support networks were incredibly effective. Villages that practiced strong cooperation were statistically way more likely to survive famines and economic hardships. And let's not forget about the specialized skills. While everyone was a jack of all trades, some peasants became real experts at specific crafts. You might have one guy who was the go-to beekeeper, or a woman who was the best brewer, or one family that handled the blacksmithing. These weren't just hobbies, they were essential services. Having a good blacksmith in your village could mean the difference between having sharp plows and sturdy tools, or not. It's estimated that a skilled medieval blacksmith, working all day, could make up to 100 nails. That doesn't sound impressive, until you realize he had to make each one by hand, from scratch, with a hammer and anvil. So, after all this ploughing, weeding, harvesting, threshing, repairing, and blacksmithing, after burning thousands and thousands of calories every single day, you'd think these folks would at least get to go home and enjoy a massive, hearty, well-deserved meal. Right? Well, about that. After a long, grueling day of what we've established is basically Olympic-level agricultural CrossFit, you'd be fantasizing about your dinner. You're probably picturing a giant haunch of roasted meat, a flagon of ale, maybe some roasted potatoes, a big round cheese, a full-on medieval feast. Well, I'm about to burst that bubble. Let's talk about what these folks actually ate. The average medieval peasant consumed somewhere around 2,000 to 3,000 calories per day. Now, on paper, that sounds pretty good, right? That's not too different from what a lot of us eat today. But there's a huge catch. They were burning way more calories than we are. They weren't sitting at a desk, in a car, or on a couch. They were doing intense physical labor for 10 to 12 hours a day. So that 3,000 calories wasn't going into a caloric surplus. It was just baseline fuel to keep the machine from breaking down. And the kind of calories they ate was completely different. The number one, undisputed, heavyweight champion of the medieval diet was bread. We're not talking about your light, fluffy, artisanal sourdough brioche from the fancy bakery. We're talking about a lot of it. Like 2 to 3 pounds of bread per person every single day. This bread was dense. It was dark, usually made from rye or barley, not expensive wheat. And it was their main source of calories. But here's the gross part. Medieval milling techniques were, to put it mildly, rustic. They ground the grain between two massive, heavy millstones. Over time, those stones would chip and wear down. And where did all those tiny bits of sand and grit go? You guessed it, right into the flour and right into the bread. Archaeologists studying medieval teeth have found that they are almost universally worn down, scraped flat, not from decay, they ate very little sugar, but from a lifetime of literally chewing on gritty, sandy bread. Talk about a real structural reason to need a dentist. So, what did they wash all this gritty bread down with? Water, right? Nope. Water was often a terrible, dangerous choice. Rivers and wells were frequently contaminated with all sorts of nasty stuff. Animal waste, human waste, runoff from tanneries. Drinking it straight was a game of bacterial roulette. So, what did everyone drink? Including the kids. Beer. But before you get too excited, this wasn't your 8% craft IPA. It was something called small beer. It was a very weak, low-alcohol beer, probably less than 1% or 2% alcohol. The brewing process, boiling the water and fermenting it, killed off most of the dangerous bacteria, making the beer genuinely safer to drink than water. That's right. In medieval times, beer was literally a health food. It's the best historical fact you'll ever find to justify your drinking habits. You're welcome. The medieval diet also followed a really strict hierarchy. The food you ate was a direct sign of your social status. The good stuff, the fine white wheaten bread, the best cuts of meat, the imported wine all went straight to the nobles in the big castle. The peasants got what was left over. And when I say left over, I mean the parts of the animal that we today would probably throw in the garbage or feed to our pets. We're talking snouts, ears, feet, and all the internal organs. They had a saying, "You use everything but the squeal." They couldn't afford to waste a single calorie. It sounds kind of gross, but in a way, they invented the original nose-to-tail zero-waste movement. The staple dish, the one they ate day in and day out, was something called pottage. Pottage is just an old word for a thick soup or stew. It was made from whatever vegetables they could grow, mostly peas, beans, onions, and cabbage, all boiled for hours in a big pot over the fire. Sometimes, if they were lucky, They'd throw in some herbs from the garden or a little bit of bacon for flavour. It was basically the medieval version of throw everything in a pot, add water, and hope for the best. This pottage was often so thick, you could supposedly stand a spoon up in it. And here's the kicker. They wouldn't just make it for one meal. That pot would often stay on the fire for days, sometimes even weeks. They'd just keep adding new ingredients to the pot as they got them, reboiling it and eating out of it continuously. It was like the world's longest-running leftover situation. A perpetual stew. So, what about meat? Fresh meat was an incredible rarity. A luxury. Maybe something you'd get to eat a few times a year, at a huge festival like Christmas or Easter. Can you imagine that? Saving up all year, looking forward for months, just to have one decent piece of meat. It's like waiting for Black Friday, but instead of getting a 70-inch TV, your grand prize is a piece of chicken. When they did have meat, it was almost always preserved. During good times, a peasant family might have some bacon or salt pork hanging from the rafters. And they were masters of food preservation. They had to be. One bad harvest, one failed crop, could mean starvation for the entire village. So they developed these amazing, ingenious techniques for smoking, salting, curing, and fermenting food. They could keep cabbage edible all through the winter by turning it into sauerkraut. They'd dry peas and beans until they were hard as rocks. Archaeologists have literally found caches of these dried peas from medieval sites, and they can still identify the species. Some of these preserved foods could last for years, which really makes our modern obsession with best by dates seem a little silly. But sometimes, preservation wasn't enough. Famines did happen. Historians estimate about once every generation. And when they did, things got truly desperate. We have historical records from the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 that describe people eating tree bark, clay, and even leather shoes just to stay alive. There's a horrifying record from that time of people being caught stealing unbaked dough from bakeries because they were so starved they couldn't even wait for it to be cooked. That's a level of hunger that is just unimaginable. Researchers estimate that during severe famines like that one, up to 15% of the population in some regions might die. These weren't just abstract statistics. These were real people, real families, making impossible, heartbreaking choices about who in the family got to eat that day. And just to make things more complicated, the church had a say in their diet too. The church declared certain days, a lot of them as fish days, where eating meat was forbidden. This included pretty much every Friday, all of Lent, and various other holy days. This sounds fine, except for one problem. Most peasants live nowhere near the coast. So, what did they eat? Well, fish was a flexible term. Medieval religious authorities, in their infinite wisdom, decided that beaver tails, because they were scaly and lived in water, and even barnacle geese, because no one knew where they migrated, so they assumed they spontaneously grew on trees, counted as fish. I am not making this up. I guess if you squint really hard and use a ton of imagination, this led to some pretty creative alternative facts about the animal kingdom. There were actual, serious scholarly debates at the time about whether barnacle geese were plants or animals. Spoiler alert, they're birds. The medieval calendar was also packed with fasting days, as many as 150 per year. On these days, you were often only allowed to eat one meal, and it usually couldn't contain any animal products. No meat, no eggs, no dairy. But medieval people were just as good at finding loopholes as we are. They got creative. They made milk out of ground-up almonds to replace dairy. They created these elaborate mock eggs from ground almonds, spices, and breadcrumbs, shaped and coloured to look just like the real thing. They were basically inventing medieval vegan alternatives. Some of these recipes have survived, and modern food historians who have tried to recreate them say they're actually surprisingly tasty, though probably not worth the effort of hand-grinding hundreds of almonds with a stone. This diet, this constant cycle of just enough food followed by not enough food, had a real, measurable impact on their bodies. Analysis of medieval bones shows a fascinating and sad story. Scientists can see growth rings in the bones, much like the rings in a tree. They can tell that peasant children often stopped growing entirely for several years during famines. Then, when food became available again, they'd have a growth spurt. Their skeletons are a literal, physical record of feast and famine. It's no surprise that recent studies suggest the average medieval peasant was several inches shorter than we are today, largely due to a lifetime of childhood malnutrition and endless, grinding hard work. But on the rare, wonderful occasions when food was plentiful, medieval peasants knew how to celebrate. Harvest festivals, after all the crops were safely brought in, could last for days. It was like a massive village-wide potluck dinner party. Everyone would bring whatever food they could spare, everyone would share, and everyone was just so incredibly grateful for the food. These feast days were the rare, bright spots in an otherwise exhausting and challenging dietary life. So, after a long day of work, eating their bowl of gritty bread and never-ending pottage, where did these folks go to sleep? Well, let's talk about what these folks called home. And trust me, it wasn't exactly something you'd see on House Hunters. So you've finished your endless workday, you've choked down your bowl of pottage and gritty bread, and now it's time to head home and relax. In medieval times, the concept of home sweet home took on a whole different meaning. Trust me, it wasn't exactly House Hunters International. Ever heard a friend complain that their one-bedroom apartment is just too small, or that their studio flat feels cramped? Well, a medieval peasant would have a good, hearty laugh at that. They would have walked into that tiny studio and thought it was a luxury mansion. The average peasant house, what they called a cruck house, was about 400 square feet. To put that in perspective, that is smaller than most modern two-car garages. And that wasn't for one person. That 400 square feet was home to the entire family: mom, dad, maybe 4 or 5 kids, and probably grandpa and grandma too. Oh, and I forgot to mention the other roommates. Their chickens, their pig, if they were lucky enough to have one, and other small animals. Yes, in winter, the animals were often brought inside to live with the family. It sounds disgusting, but it was actually a smart 2-for-1 deal. The animals were protected from the cold and from thieves, and their body heat helped keep the one-room hut just a tiny bit warmer. But yeah, talk about an early, very smelly version of an indoor petting zoo. So, what were these houses built from? Not brick, not stone, not nice milled lumber. The vast majority of peasant houses were built using a technique called wattle and daub. It sounds like a folk band, but it's actually a construction method. First, they'd build a basic wooden frame. Then, the wattle part. They would weave a bunch of thin, flexible sticks, like hazel or willow, in and out of the frame, basically creating a giant, rough basket. Then came the daub. This was a delightful cocktail of mud, clay, straw, and, yes, animal poop. Lovely. They'd smear this sticky, smelly plaster all over the wattle, inside and out. Now, it's easy to make fun of it, but when this daub mixture dried, it became incredibly strong and surprisingly well insulated. Recent archaeological experiments, where historians have actually rebuilt these houses using the original methods, have shown that a well-maintained wattle and daub wall could easily last for 50 years. Not too bad for a wall made of mud and poop. And the best part? If a wall started to crumble or a hole appeared, you didn't need a contractor. You just mixed up a fresh batch of daub and slapped it on. It was like a medieval DIY spackle. Inside, the luxury continued. About 90% of peasant houses had dirt floors, just packed earth. That was it. To make it slightly more comfortable, they would spread fresh rushes, like straw or reeds, on the floor. Sometimes they'd mix in sweet-smelling herbs like lavender or mint to try and cover up the smell of people and animals living in a small, unventilated space. But they didn't sweep these rushes out every day, or every week, or even every month. When the top layer got too disgusting, filled with spilled food, mud, animal droppings, and who knows what else, they would just add a fresh layer on top. It was like having a living compost pile right in your living room. Archaeologists who excavate these house sites have actually found layers upon layers of this compressed flooring, sometimes up to 6 inches deep. Each layer is a perfect, gross little time capsule, telling them exactly what the family ate and what fell on the floor. What about the roof? The roof was typically thatched. This meant a super thick layer of straw or reeds, sometimes up to 2 feet thick. A good thatch roof was actually fantastic at keeping out the rain, but it was also a 5-star, all-inclusive resort for rats, mice, spiders, and a whole universe of insects. Medieval peasants basically had an entire ecosystem living right above their heads. And chimneys? Forget it. A chimney was a high-tech luxury, something you'd only see in a castle or a manor house. For a peasant, the fire was just a shallow pit in the middle of the dirt floor called a hearth. So, where did all the smoke go? It just went up. It would filter its way through the thatch roof, turning the inside of the hut into a very smoky, very sooty-smelling place. This actually had one accidental benefit. The constant smoke would help preserve the roof beams and, more importantly, it acted as a natural insecticide, fumigating the thatch and keeping some of the bugs at bay. Modern scientists studying this have found that this smoke treatment literally created a layer of chemicals on the straw that made it last longer. Accidental genius. Windows? They were more like wind holes. That's literally where the word window comes from. Most peasant houses had no glass. Glass was insanely expensive. Instead, they just had small openings in the walls. To keep out the rain and wind, they might have simple wooden shutters they could close, or maybe a piece of oiled parchment or thin, scraped animal hide stretched over the hole, which would let in a tiny bit of murky light. During the dead of winter, they'd just stuff the holes with straw or old rags to keep the cold out, plunging the home into near total darkness. And at night, the light situation was, as we mentioned, bleak. Their main light source was a rushlight, a dried reed dipped in leftover animal fat. It gave off about as much light as a single sad birthday candle, and a lot of smoke. Recent experiments by historians trying to replicate these conditions showed that a typical medieval peasant house at night had about 1/100th the light level of a modern home. Once it got dark, you pretty much had two choices: huddle around the fire or go to bed. And what were they sleeping on? Furniture was minimal. A family might have a rough wooden table, a couple of benches to sit on, and maybe one big wooden chest to store their few precious belongings, like their best clothes and any metal tools. Beds? As in, a bed frame with a mattress? That was a luxury for the rich. Most people slept on straw-stuffed mattresses called palliases, lying right on the cold, damp, rush-covered dirt floor. And it gets real cozy when everyone slept together for warmth. The entire family, mom, dad, kids, and maybe a visiting cousin, would all huddle together under shared blankets, probably made of coarse, scratchy wool. Records from some manors show that even a well-off peasant might only own furniture worth a few pennies, in total the equivalent of maybe $100 today. And where did the garbage go? Well, just outside the door. Every house had a midden, which is just a fancy archaeological word for the medieval garbage dump. And it was right there. Scientists have found everything in these middens: broken pottery, animal bones from their pottage, worn-out tools, lost coins. It's a treasure trove for archaeologists, like a perfectly preserved time capsule of daily life. One archaeologist in England found a perfectly preserved pair of medieval wooden clogs in a midden. Turns out, medieval fashion wasn't all that different from some of today's questionable, trendy shoes. But here's what's smart. The layout of the villages themselves was actually pretty ingenious. Houses were usually built very close together, clustered around a central green or common area where animals could graze and kids could play. Recent studies of these village layouts show they were often deliberately designed to maximize sunlight on the houses and minimize wind exposure. They knew a thing or two about passive solar and energy efficiency. Archaeological surveys have also revealed that many villages were built on slight slopes, with carefully planned drainage channels to prevent the very muddy streets from flooding. It was medieval urban planning at its finest. But living in these cramped close quarters meant everyone knew everyone else's business. Privacy? That was not a medieval concept. You could probably hear your neighbour's entire argument about whose turn it was to clean the communal pig pen. And the court records from the time are full of these hilarious petty disputes between neighbours, disputes about wandering chickens scratching up a garden, or one person's tree casting too much shade on another's cabbages. Some things, it seems, never change. And let's talk about home maintenance. It was a never-ending, all-consuming job. The thatch roof needed to be repaired constantly to prevent leaks. The daub walls needed patching every time there was a heavy rain, and you can only imagine the smell. But, like everything else in their lives, most major repairs were a community event. When someone's roof needed rethatching, the whole village would pitch in. It was like a medieval version of a barn raising, probably complete with a big barrel of small beer and some shared food to celebrate getting the work done. With houses being what they were, dark, smoky, Cramped and full of animals, it's really no wonder that people spent as much time outside as humanly possible. But stepping outside your wattle and daub hut meant stepping into a whole different world. A world of complicated, bizarre and ironclad rules and laws. A system that could make today's most complicated Hoe agreement look like a friendly suggestion. Now, living in that cramped, smoky, poop and mud hut was one thing. But the second you stepped outside that door, you were stepping into a world governed by a system so complicated, so rigid, and so utterly bizarre, it makes today's most nightmarish HOA agreement look like a friendly suggestion. This was the feudal system. And the feudal system wasn't just complicated. It was like being born into a weird, lifelong game of Simon Says, where Simon was your local lord, and not following his exact rules could cost you way more than just being out of the game. It could cost you your food, your home, or even your life. Let's start with the basics. When a peasant was born, they were basically born into a subscription service they could never, ever cancel. From the moment they took their first breath, they were tied to the land and to the lord of the manor. And this lord, in exchange for protecting them, mostly from other lords, demanded, well, pretty much everything. We're not talking about a small, reasonable cut. Historical records show that peasants had to give up a massive chunk of their crops, their livestock, and their labor to their lord. This could be as high as 50% of everything they produced. Imagine that. You work yourself to the bone all year, in the mud and the rain, and then your landlord just waltzes over and takes half of your groceries. It's like having a really, really demanding roommate who doesn't actually live with you, doesn't help with any of the chores, but still eats half of all your food. Some manor records even show that peasants had to give their lord the first and best loaf of bread from every baking, or the best eggs from their chickens. The lord always got the best slice. But it didn't stop there. The lords had rules for everything. You couldn't just go into his forest, and pick up some firewood to heat your hut. Oh no. You were only allowed to take by hook or by crook, which meant only what you could pull down from a tree with a shepherd's crook, or what had already fallen. If you were caught chopping down a living tree for warmth, that was a massive fine. Want to go hunting? Absolutely not. All the wild animals, the deer, the boar, even the rabbits hopping around on your own patch of land, technically belonged to the lord. If you got caught killing a rabbit to feed your starving family, you could be fined, publicly whipped, or worse. Even the fish in the local streams were off limits. Medieval lords were exactly like that one kid at school who claimed ownership of everything. That's mine, and that's mine, and, oh yeah, the air you're breathing? That's definitely mine too. And speaking of not being able to do what you want, peasants couldn't just pack up and move. They couldn't just decide, you know what, I'm sick of this lord. I'm going to go try my luck in the next village over. They were literally bound to the soil. It was a form of serfdom. If you wanted to leave your village for any reason, you had to get your lord's permission, and you'd probably have to pay a fee. This even applied to getting married. If a peasant wanted to marry someone from another village, they needed permission. Some medieval records show peasants having to pay their lord a fine, called a merchet, just for permission to let his daughter marry someone. Talk about an expensive dating scene. One court record from 1293 shows a peasant had to pay his lord 2 chickens just for permission to let his daughter get married. So what happened when you broke one of these thousands of rules? You'd be hauled before the manor court. These weren't your fancy modern courtrooms with judges in robes. They were often held in the open air, under a big tree, or maybe in the great hall of the manor house. And the lord, or his steward, would sit in judgment over everything. We're talking property disputes, petty crimes, accusations of bad ploughing, everything. One court record from 1320 shows a man being fined for making excessive noise while brewing his beer. Apparently, medieval noise complaints were already a thing. Another record shows someone being fined for spreading gossip. That's right, medieval defamation law, in action. But here's the surprising part. Peasants actually did have some legal rights, even if they were pretty basic. They could bring cases to the manor court themselves, and the records show they often won. Historians studying these medieval court records found that in some areas, about 40% of cases brought by peasants against their social superiors were successful. Not bad for a system that was completely, totally stacked against them. Court records also show that women could, and did, bring cases to court. They made up about 15% of all plaintiffs in some regions, suing over property, debt, and even personal slander. The punishment system, though, that was creative, to say the least. Minor offences might get you a fine, payable in chickens or grain usually, but more serious, or repeat, offences could land you in the stocks. This was the medieval version of public shaming, turned up to 11. You'd be locked into a wooden frame in the middle of the village square, unable to move, while all your neighbours, your friends, your family, walked by, pointed, laughed, and maybe threw rotten vegetables, or worse, at you for a day. And some villages had a ducking stool, which was usually reserved for women accused of being scolds, that is to say, women who argued too much or gossiped. It was basically a chair on the end of a long wooden lever. They'd strap you into the chair and then duck you into the freezing, filthy village pond, over and over again. It was like a medieval dunk tank, except way, way less fun. On top of all these official laws, village life had its own set of powerful, unwritten rules. Everyone was expected to help during the harvest. Everyone was expected to pitch in during an emergency, like a fire. Recent studies of village records show that those who regularly helped their neighbours were far more likely to receive help when they needed it. It was an early, informal form of a social credit score. One of the strangest and most fascinating aspects was the hue and cry system. If you witnessed a crime, say, you saw someone stealing your neighbour's pig, you were legally required to start yelling about it at the top of your lungs. "Stop thief! Stop thief!" And everyone who heard you had to immediately stop what they were doing and join the chase. It was like a medieval flash mob of justice. Court records actually show people getting fined for not participating. In one village, a man was fined 2 pennies, which was a lot, maybe $50 in today's money, for hearing the hue and cry and not joining the chase. It was probably the most expensive missed workout ever. But by far the most bizarre laws, the ones that make you just scratch your head, involved animals. If an animal, a pig, a cow, even a chicken killed someone, that animal could be put on trial. Yes, you read that right. There are actual, official court records of pigs being tried for murder, complete with defense attorneys and witnesses. One famous case from 1386 involved a pig that was found guilty of killing a child. For its trial and subsequent execution, they actually dressed it in human clothes. They gave it a little jacket and pants, probably to make the whole proceeding seem more legitimate. Respectable? I have no idea. But these animal trials weren't a joke. They were considered serious legal proceedings, with detailed records kept of the evidence, the verdicts, and the often gruesome executions. Speaking of highly questionable legal and medical practices, now is probably a good time to talk about what happened when you got sick. If you hate going to the doctor now, trust me, you would not have enjoyed medieval medicine. You'll be thanking your lucky stars for your modern health insurance after hearing this. If you thought their legal system was wild, their medical knowledge was a truly mind-blowing mix of superstition, blind guesswork, and things that sound like they came from a Halloween prank gone horribly wrong. Medieval doctors had a real thing for blood, specifically getting it out of you. This was called bloodletting. Got a headache? Let's drain some blood. Got a stomachache? More bloodletting. Stubbed your toe? You guessed it. Time to break out the leeches. These doctors, who were often just monks or priests, believed that all illnesses came from an imbalance of 4 bodily humours, and bloodletting was their favourite, one-size-fits-all solution. One medical text from the time recommended removing up to 1.5 litres of blood in a single session. That's like forcibly giving away 3 blood donations at once. It's a miracle anyone survived the cure. But peasants rarely got to see these qualified doctors anyway. Instead, they relied on local healers, wise women, and herbalists. And here's the thing. These folks, the ones without the fancy robes, actually knew their stuff, mostly. Recent studies of medieval herbal remedies have shown that about 80% of them had genuine medicinal properties. They knew which plants could reduce a fever, which ones could soothe a cough, and which ones could stop bleeding. The other 20%? Well, let's just say that eating powdered owl brain probably didn't cure your insomnia like they claimed. One medieval medical book seriously recommended curing baldness by rubbing your head with fresh chicken poop. Somehow, that particular treatment didn't survive to modern times. Some of their other cures were just creative. Got a toothache? The official remedy was to go kiss a donkey. Headache? Tie a dead mole to your head. The really fun treatments involved wearing various bits of animals around your neck as an amulet. Everything from a dried frog to a fox's tooth. It was like medieval jewelry, just way, way grosser and smellier. One popular cure for rheumatism was to simply carry a raw potato in your pocket until it rotted. At least that one was relatively harmless. But it wasn't all quackery. Archaeologists studying medieval skeletons have found that some peasants actually survived brain surgery. They've discovered skulls with perfectly round, neat holes drilled into them, where the bone had healed over, showing the patient lived for years afterward. The success rate for this procedure, called trepanning, was estimated to be around 80%. That is staggering, considering they were basically drilling holes in people's heads with hand tools, probably to release evil spirits or cure headaches. When the Black Death hit in 1348, things got really interesting. Doctors came up with all sorts of bizarre protective gear, including those crazy, iconic beak-shaped masks. They looked like terrifying bird costumes. But the beaks were stuffed with herbs, flowers, and spices. The idea was that the bad air miasma causing the plague would be filtered by the nice-smelling herbs. It didn't work, obviously, but some of those herbs, like lavender and mint, did have natural antiseptic properties and at least kept the smell of death at bay. Some towns, in a panic, tried to fight the plague by banishing all cats, thinking they were a source of evil. This, of course, made things 1,000 times worse, because the rat population exploded without their natural predators. Speaking of the plague, one popular treatment was to cut open a live pigeon and strap it to the patient's feet until it grew cold. The theory was that the pigeon would draw out the disease. Spoiler, it did not work. But it probably kept the patient in bed. Who's going to walk around with dead pigeons strapped to their feet? They also had this oddly specific belief that red objects could cure fever. Some doctors would wrap their patients in red blankets, hang red tapestries on the walls, and make them stare at red objects for hours. Women, particularly in the villages, often served as the primary healers. They were the midwives, the herbalists, the ones who actually knew which plants worked. But here's the terrible, terrible catch. If they were too good at healing, if their success rate was a little too high, they ran a very real risk of being accused of witchcraft. Talk about a high-stakes, stressful performance review. And medieval surgery? It was basically carpentry, but on people. Most surgeons were also barbers. Yes, really. That's why the traditional barber pole is red and white. It represents blood and bandages. Their motto was basically, fast is good, faster is better. Why? Because they had no anesthesia, except for a lot of alcohol and maybe a stick to bite on. Archaeological evidence and medical texts show that a skilled barber surgeon could amputate a leg in under 3 minutes. Some were known for removing bladder stones, a horribly painful condition, in under 2 minutes. But it wasn't all bad. They did have some smart ideas, even if they didn't know why they worked. Honey was widely used as an antiseptic on wounds, and it actually works. We know today that honey has natural antibacterial properties. They also used moldy bread on infections, accidentally discovering penicillin about 800 years before Alexander Fleming, and they even figured out how to set broken bones surprisingly well. Archaeologists have found many medieval skeletons with fractures that had healed perfectly, showing a high level of skill. Despite all this, if a medieval peasant made it past the dangers of childhood, which was a huge if, they had a decent chance of living to a ripe old age. Studies of medieval graveyards show that about 10% of the adult population lived past 60, and some even made it to 70. Not too shabby, considering their medical care consisted largely of bleeding, weird animal parts, and kissing donkeys. But staying healthy wasn't just about medicine. It was also about blowing off steam. And between all the hard work, the crazy laws, and the questionable medical treatments, medieval peasants knew how to party in ways that would make modern festival goers look tame. You'd think that after all that, the back-breaking work, the mud and poop houses, the bizarre laws, the donkey-kissing doctors, these folks would just collapse at the end of the day, exhausted and miserable. But you'd be wrong. Between all the hardship, medieval peasants absolutely knew how to let loose. In fact, they partied harder, and more often than most of us do today. Remember those vacation days we talked about? The medieval calendar had, by some estimates, about 50 official holidays per year. That's way more than the handful of public holidays we get. Sure, most of them were holy days, religious festivals like Christmas, Easter, and a whole slew of saints' days. But medieval people, in their infinite wisdom, figured out that Holy Day was just another way of spelling party time. They turned pretty much any excuse into a massive celebration. Let's take May Day, for example. This wasn't just your quiet little spring celebration with a few flowers. This was like Coachella, a carnival, and a village-wide dating app all rolled into one. The night before, young, unmarried people would go a-maying in the woods. This was a socially sanctioned excuse to go out all night, unsupervised, into the forest, which basically meant sneaking off to flirt, hook up, and just generally cause trouble. They'd come back the next morning, carrying flowers and branches to decorate the village. And then they'd set up the maypole. And these weren't little poles. Some maypoles were so tall and so heavy, they had to be permanently planted in the village green, because it took dozens of men to even get them upright. We have one record from 1343 that mentions a maypole in London that was taller than the local church steeple. As you can imagine, the church wasn't exactly thrilled about all this. We have countless records of grumpy priests complaining in their sermons about the ungodly, sinful and pagan behaviour that went on during May Day festivities. But nobody really listened. And then there were sports. Medieval sports were, let's just say intense is an understatement. They were less organised sports and more barely controlled riots. Take their version of football. This wasn't played on a neat, rectangular field with 11 players on each side. Oh no. This was played through the entire village. Sometimes, it was played between two entire villages. We're talking hundreds of players, an inflated pig's bladder for a ball, and pretty much no rules except get the ball to your end of town. The goal might be the church door in one village and the tavern door in the other, 2 miles away. Records from the time are full of complaints about broken windows, smashed fences, and serious injuries. One game in 1280 allegedly ended with 3 deaths and a barn being burned down. It makes modern soccer hooligans look positively tame. They also had this interesting game called cock throwing. The name is, unfortunately, exactly what it sounds like. They would tie a rooster to a stake, and people would take turns throwing sticks at it. The person who finally killed it with their stick got to keep the rooster. Thankfully, that's one pastime that definitely didn't survive to modern times. But what about just relaxing? Music was everywhere in medieval life. You didn't need fancy, expensive instruments. People made music with whatever they had. Spoons, pots, and even animal bones became percussion instruments. Archaeological digs have found tons of simple, little flutes, called pipes, carved from the leg bones of sheep or birds. Archaeologists have actually recreated some of these bone flutes, and surprisingly, they sound pretty good. And if you wanted professional entertainment, you'd wait for the minstrels to come to town. These were travelling musicians, storytellers, and acrobats. They were like the medieval radio, Twitter feed, and circus all rolled into one. They'd travel from village to village, bringing news from the outside world, singing epic songs about heroes and battles, and probably some very inappropriate ones too, and spreading all the latest gossip. And of course there were drinking games. Oh yeah, they definitely had those. Taverns and alehouses were the social centres of the village. A popular game involved a large communal bowl of ale. Everyone had to drink from it in turn, taking a sip, but you couldn't spill a single drop. If you spilled, your punishment was you had to drink more ale. Talk about a win-win situation. Taverns were so critical to village life that some manor records actually required the local alewife, brewing was often a woman's job, to keep her tavern open at all times. Records from some villages show there was 1 tavern for every 20 households. These people took their social drinking very seriously. The biggest parties of all, though, were wedding celebrations. A wedding wasn't a quiet, one-day affair. It could last for days. The entire village would contribute food and drink. Everyone would bring what they could to the feast. The whole community would join in the dancing, singing, and celebrating. And they had some really wild traditions. We have records describing mock weddings where, for fun, men would dress up as brides and women would dress up as grooms. They also played games like hot cockles. This was basically a game where one person would get blindfolded, bend over, and then get hit on the back. They'd have to guess who hit them. Sounds like a great way to start a fight at a wedding, if you ask me. Archaeological evidence shows that some villages even had special feast halls or guild halls built just for hosting these massive wedding parties and celebrations. And here's something cool. Medieval peasants basically invented, or at least popularized, a lot of the indoor games we still play today. Chess, backgammon, and even card games were super popular ways to pass the long, dark winter nights. Their version of cards looked pretty different though. We've found fragments of hand-painted decks from the 1440 seconds that show kings riding unicorns and queens fighting dragons. Way cooler than our boring standard-issue cards, if you ask me. They also played dice games constantly, but with a twist. Archaeologists have found a lot of medieval dice in their digs, and a surprising number of them are loaded. They're weighted or shaved to land on a certain number more often. Turns out, medieval gamblers were just as crafty, and just as willing to cheat, as modern ones. Special celebrations marked every single changing of the season, but the harvest festivals were the wildest of all. Once all the crops were in, once that desperate race against the weather was finally over, the entire village would hold a massive feast called a harvest home. The lord of the manor was actually expected to provide most of the food and, more importantly, a ton of ale for his peasants as a thank you for their work. Records from one manor show that the peasants went through 100 gallons of ale in a single night of celebration. Finally, a decent perk of the feudal system. These festivals also included all sorts of competitions. We're talking wrestling matches, archery contests. Everyone wanted to be Robin Hood. And even medieval versions of carnival rides. Young people would make these crazy, dangerous-looking swings by tying long ropes to high tree branches. Or they'd build massive seesaws using logs and planks. One chronicle from the time mentions a village getting in trouble because their makeshift merry-go-round, which was basically just a big pole with ropes attached that people would grab and run with until they were sent flying, got a bit too exciting, and someone got launched straight into the village duck pond. Court records are actually full of complaints and fines related to these homemade amusements. Apparently, medieval health and safety regulations were pretty loose. But not all entertainment was a wild party. Storytelling was huge. After dinner, especially in the dark of winter, families would huddle around the fire and share tales. Some stories were educational, some were funny, and some were definitely not suitable for children. This is where many of our classic fairy tales come from, passed down verbally long before anyone wrote them down. And the originals were a lot darker than the Disney versions. We found medieval story collections that had to be hidden from children because they were considered way too spicy. Medieval Netflix and chill, anyone? Speaking of chill, what about medieval relationships? You might think that in such a strict, rule-bound world, romance was out of the question. But you won't believe the wild, weird, and surprisingly modern world of medieval dating and marriage. You might think that medieval romance was all about knights rescuing princesses from towers, or love at first sight across a crowded, muddy market square. But for a medieval peasant, courtship and marriage were way more complicated, and honestly, way more interesting than that. Forget Tinder, forget dating apps. Medieval peasants had their own complex, wild, and sometimes downright bizarre ways of finding the one. First off, let's bust a big myth. We often think people in the Middle Ages got married super young, like at 12 or 13. While that did happen, especially among the high nobility for political alliances, it wasn't the norm for regular folks. Historical records, like tax rolls and parish registers, show that the average age for marriage for a peasant woman was actually around 20 to 22, and for a man, it was even older, around 24 to 26. That's surprisingly not that different from today. The reason was purely practical. A couple couldn't get married until they could actually afford to. They needed a place to live, their own 400 square foot hut, maybe. And crucially, they needed land to farm. A man often had to wait until his father died or retired to inherit the family plot. So yeah, if you weren't married by 25, you were definitely getting side-eyed at all the village festivals. But it wasn't the child marriage fest we sometimes imagine. So, how did you date? It wasn't exactly casual. Young, unmarried people met in the same places people do now. At social gatherings. This meant at church, at the raucous village festivals we just talked about, at weddings and, of course, while working. The fields were a huge place for dating. You're out there weeding side by side with someone for 8 hours a day. You're going to strike up a conversation. And they had their own ways of flirting. We have court records that tell us about one very creative young man who kept accidentally letting one of his sheep wander into a specific girl's family field. Why? So he'd have an excuse to go over and retrieve it and talk to her. It was medieval flirting at its absolute finest. Unfortunately, it didn't end well for him. Her father eventually took him to the manor court for damaging his crops with the wandering sheep, and the guy got fined. Talk about a very, very expensive date. In another record from 1326, a different guy got caught trying to climb a wall to leave flowers in a girl's window. Super romantic. Right until he lost his footing and fell straight into the family's pigsty below. But romance was only part of the equation. For their parents, marriage was a serious business decision. They were usually heavily involved in arranging the matches, and they weren't just thinking about love. They were thinking, does his family have good land? Is she a hard worker? Does her family own 2 oxen or just 1? Are his family's chickens good layers? I'm not kidding. We have a court record from 1319 where a father refused to let his daughter marry a suitor because the groom's family owned what he called inferior chickens. Love is great, but a good flock of chickens? That's security. Archaeological evidence even shows that these negotiations often involved the exchange of practical gifts. Researchers have found simple, touching engagement tokens, like rings woven from straw or small, delicately carved wooden spoons, given as a promise. Now, here is the single wildest fact about medieval marriage. To get legally married, you didn't need a priest, you didn't need a church, you didn't even need witnesses. All a couple had to do was stand face to face and exchange promises, in the present tense. Something as simple as, I take you as my wife, and I take you as my husband, and boom, that was it. You were married. Legally, bindingly married in the eyes of God and the law. As you can probably guess, this led to some insane court cases. The church courts were flooded with, he said. She said arguments about whether or not a marriage had actually happened. We have records of people claiming they got married while they were drunk in a tavern. We have records of women suing men, saying, he promised to marry me, and the guy saying, no, I said, I will marry you, which is the future tense, not the present tense, so it doesn't count. There was one famous case where a couple claimed they got married by exchanging their vows while hiding in a barn during a thunderstorm, and the court had to decide if that was valid. Spoiler, they often ruled that it was. But assuming your marriage was properly planned, the wedding celebration itself was, as we've said, a huge deal. The whole village would pitch in, and the party could last for days. The bride didn't wear white. That's a much more modern tradition. She'd just wear her absolute best dress. For a peasant, this was usually a brightly coloured one, often blue, a symbol of purity, or green. Red was also popular, except in some villages where it was considered unlucky because it was the devil's colour. Studies of medieval clothing fragments show that brides often borrowed, or even rented special clothes or jewellery from wealthier neighbours for their big day. Some things really never change. Once you were married, family life was different too. A newly married couple often couldn't afford their own hut right away. So, they'd move in with one set of parents. Yes, you'd be living in that 400 square foot, one-room, animal-filled hut with your new spouse and your in-laws. Can you imagine the drama? And we don't have to imagine it, because the court records are full of it. We have hilarious, petty arguments between mothers-in-law and new daughters-in-law about who was in charge of the all-important pottage pot. One record from 1352 describes a 3-day, all-out family argument about whose turn it was to feed the chickens. Another mentions a massive family feud that started because someone used the wrong spoon to stir the pottage. Children were a blessing, but they were also, from a very early age, more hands to help with the work. This wasn't a modern childhood of playdates and cartoons. By the age of 6 or 7, kids were expected to be contributing. Their chores were real jobs, scaring those birds from the crops, that summer job we talked about, gathering firewood, fetching water, helping their mothers with spinning wool, or watching the younger children. But it wasn't all work. Archaeologists have found tons of medieval toys in their digs. They've found little toy knights, tiny clay horses, marbles made of stone, wooden swords, and even little spinning tops. They also found medieval baby bottles, carved from cow horns with a piece of leather for a nipple, And scientists analyzing the residue inside these bottles found traces of milk proteins, proving that's exactly what they were used for. The roles of men and women were pretty rigidly fixed, but with some very cool surprises. Men did the heavy field work, like ploughing and ditch digging. Women were in charge of the home, the hut, the garden, the chickens, the children, and the insanely time-consuming job of turning raw wool into clothing. But women could also own businesses. We have records of female brewers, alewives, bakers, and even female blacksmiths. One village had a woman who was the official, salaried rat catcher. She was apparently so good at her job that other nearby villages kept trying to hire her away. An analysis of medieval tax records shows that in some towns, up to 30% of all businesses were owned and operated by women. And marriage wasn't always forever. While divorce as we know it didn't really exist, you could get an annulment from the church court. You just had to prove that your marriage was invalid in the first place. And the excuses people came up with were amazing. One man claimed his marriage should be annulled because his wife was too fond of cheese, and he found it suspicious. Another claimed his wife was a witch because, he swore, their chickens stopped laying eggs the day after they got married. The church courts heard thousands of these cases. Some historians estimate that as many as 5% of all medieval marriages eventually ended in an annulment. But despite all the rules, all the practical arrangements, and all the meddling parents, medieval people still found ways to follow their hearts. The court records are full of true romance. They're full of stories about couples who ran away together against their parents' wishes. They're full of secret marriages whispered in barns. We have records of a man getting fined for stealing flowers from the Lord's own garden to give to his sweetheart. Another young man was caught carving love poems into a church wall. And they're still there today. Archaeologists have even found tiny, touching love letters, written on scraps of birch bark and hidden away in the wattle and daub walls of a peasant hut. Speaking of the church, its role in marriage and annulments was just the tip of the iceberg. The church didn't just influence the life of a medieval peasant, it controlled it. And trust me, when it came to medieval religion, things got really, really interesting and really, really expensive. So we've seen how the church had its hand in everything from marriage to your diet. But that was just the beginning. For a medieval peasant, the church wasn't just a place you went on Sundays. It was an all-powerful, all-encompassing entity that ruled your life with an iron fist and a very hungry collection plate. For peasants who were already living on the absolute edge, religion wasn't just about faith. It was a massive financial burden. Let's start with the big one, the tithe. Tithe literally means 1/10, and they meant it. Peasants were legally required to give the church 1/10 of everything they produced. Got 10 eggs from your chickens? One of them belongs to the priest. Harvested 10 bags of grain? Yep, one of those goes straight to the church barn. Had 10 apples? Same deal. 10 lambs born? You get the picture. For a family that was barely growing enough food to not starve over the winter, giving up 10% of their livelihood was a crushing blow. And this was on top of the 50% or more they already owed to their Lord. It's an absolute miracle they had anything left for themselves. But oh, the fun didn't stop there. The tithe was just the cover charge. You had to pay extra for pretty much any religious service you needed. Want your new baby baptized? That'll cost you a chicken, or maybe a nice cheese. Getting married? You'd better save up some grain to pay the priest for the ceremony. Even dying wasn't free. Families had to scrape together a payment for the funeral service, and for the privilege of being buried in the holy ground of the churchyard. We have a diary entry from one peasant in 1324 who complains bitterly that his family had to sell their only cow, their main source of milk, and future calves just to pay for his father's funeral. It was spiritually essential, but economically devastating. The church also controlled your time. As we mentioned, the calendar was packed with holy days, saints' days, and feast days where working in the fields was strictly forbidden. Now, a day off sounds great, right? Until you realize that no work also meant no food production. And it really wasn't great when your entire wheat crop was perfectly ripe and a massive rainstorm was forecast for the next day, but you couldn't harvest it because it was, say, Street Marks Day. And they were serious about this. We have manor court records showing peasants being dragged before the Lord and heavily fined for trying to secretly harvest their own crops on a holy day, even when they were just trying to save their family's food supply from being ruined. One desperate farmer was caught picking peas on a saint's day. His fine was more than twice what the peas themselves were worth. So you have this all-powerful institution demanding your money, your food, and your time. How did the peasants deal with it? Well, they developed this fascinating, very practical blend of official, capital C church Christianity and all the older local folk beliefs that had been around for centuries. They were, in short, covering all their spiritual bases. A peasant would absolutely go to Mass on Sunday and pray to Jesus and the Virgin Mary. But on Monday afternoon, he might also secretly visit the local wise woman to get a good luck charm to bury in his field to bless the crops. Or he might leave a little offering of milk out for the Fae or Puck, the local nature spirits, so they wouldn't mess with his livestock. Archaeological digs in peasant huts have found this blend fascinatingly preserved. They'll find a simple, carved wooden Christian cross, buried right next to a witch bottle or a bundle of herbs, and strange bones tied together as a protective amulet. It wasn't that they didn't believe in Christianity, it's that they believed in everything. For a peasant whose entire life depended on the whims of weather and disease, any belief that might help your crops grow or keep your cow from getting sick was worth trying. The local priest had an immense, almost unbelievable amount of power over the peasants' daily lives. He was often one of the only literate people in the village. He controlled their access to everything. He could, if he wanted to, refuse to give them the sacraments like communion or last rites. And in a time when people fervently believed that you needed these rituals to get into heaven, this was the ultimate spiritual blackmail. If you didn't pay your tithes, or if you were seen as disobedient, the priest could essentially hold your eternal soul hostage. We have records of one priest who refused to baptize a peasant's newborn baby, a baby who could die at any moment from childhood diseases, until the family paid an old church debt with interest. But just like with anything, there were good ones and bad ones. The manor court rolls also mention a different priest who would regularly accept manual labor in the church's own gardens instead of a money or grain payment from the poorest families, knowing they just didn't have it to give. The church building itself was another constant drain on the peasants' resources. It was usually the only stone building in the village, and it was a source of pride, but it needed upkeep. And who do you think had to provide that upkeep? The peasants. They had to provide their labor for free to maintain the church walls, fix the roof, or build a new bell tower. This was on top of all the work they owed their lord, and all the work they had to do on their own land. One village account from the 14th century shows the peasants spending 6 weeks rebuilding a collapsed church wall. That's 6 weeks, right in the middle of the good weather season, that they couldn't be working their own fields to grow their own food. But they had no choice. Refusing to help could get you excommunicated. Excommunication was the nuclear option. It meant you were formally kicked out of the church. But it wasn't just a spiritual punishment. It was a social one. It meant you were completely cut off from the community. No one was allowed to talk to you, to trade with you, to help you. It was a social death sentence. And of course, the single most powerful tool the church used to keep peasants in line was the very real, very terrifying fear of hell. Church walls weren't painted with nice fluffy clouds and happy angels. They were covered in massive, graphic, terrifying paintings called dooms. These paintings showed, in gruesome detail, exactly what would happen to you if you sinned. You'd see peasants being boiled in cauldrons by demons for stealing food. You'd see merchants being force-fed molten gold for being greedy. You'd see people being tortured in 1,000 different, horrifying ways for skipping Mass or not paying their tithes. For a peasant who couldn't read, these paintings were their Bible, and they were a very powerful motivator. We see this fear in the court records. We have records from peasant trials where people would confess to tiny, minor crimes they committed 20 years earlier, like stealing a single loaf of bread, or lying about a chicken because they were on their deathbed and were genuinely bone-deep terrified of dying with an unconfessed sin on their soul. But medieval peasants were nothing if not creative and resilient. They found clever, quiet ways to navigate all these religious demands. They'd negotiate with saints, promising a future payment or a pilgrimage if the saint would just help them now. They'd pool their money between families to share the cost of a funeral service. Some would even strategically time their confessions for right after the harvest, when they actually had a bit of grain or a chicken to give the priest as penance. Looking at all these records, the court cases, the tithe barns, the archaeological finds, It shows us just how incredibly savvy medieval peasants were. They were constantly finding ways to balance their genuine, deeply held beliefs with the harsh economic realities of their lives. They'd bend the rules when they had to, follow them when they couldn't, and all the while somehow keep their spirits up. Their complicated relationship with the church, this mix of true faith, financial burden, and social control, really just sums up what it meant to be a medieval peasant. Life was incredibly, unbelievably hard, but they always found a way to make it work. Maybe in that way, when you strip away the mud and the pottage, they weren't so different from people today. Just trying to navigate life's complicated rules, all while trying to keep food on the table, and a little bit of hope in their hearts. So, for the past 8 parts, we've been building a picture of this incredibly tough, complex and rigid world. A world of back-breaking labour, of mud and daub huts, of a diet of gritty bread and pottage. A world governed by the ironclad rules of the feudal lord and the all-powerful, all-seeing church. It was a system that, for all its hardships, had been in place for centuries. It was just the way things were. You were born a peasant, you worked the land your father worked, you paid your dues to the lord and the priest, you lived in your village, and you died there, just like your ancestors. It was a world that seemed like it would, and could, never change. And then, in 1347, it all came to an end. In the section on medicine, we talked about the Black Death. We talked about the beaked plague doctors, the weird cures, and the sheer terror of a disease that no one understood. But the medical horror of the plague was just the beginning. The real story, the thing that fundamentally tore up the entire medieval rulebook we've been learning, was what happened after. The Black Death wasn't just a tragedy. It was a cosmic reset button. It was, for the medieval peasant, the end of the world as they knew it. And it was the single most important event of the entire Middle Ages. It's almost impossible for us to comprehend the scale of what happened. Imagine a disease so fast, so deadly, that it wipes out 1/3 to 1/2 of the entire population. Not of a town, not of a city, of the continent. We're talking 75 to 200 million people, gone in about 4 years. Imagine walking through your village, where you knew every single one of the 200 people who lived there, and a month later, 100 of them are dead. The fields are silent, the huts are empty. The priest is dead, the lord of the manor is dead, half of your family is dead. There are entire villages that were just wiped off the map, gone. Archaeologists find them today, just fields with the faint outlines of houses under the grass, abandoned in 1349 and never touched again. The immediate, practical effect of this, once the initial wave of horror and grief passed, was something no one had ever seen before. A catastrophic labour shortage. For centuries, the entire feudal system had been built on a surplus of people. There were always more peasants than there was land. This meant the lords held all the cards. If you complained about your workload, the lord could just say, "Fine, get out." He could have 10 other families lining up to take your spot before you'd even packed your bags. This power dynamic was the glue that held the whole system together. The Black Death shattered it. Suddenly, for the first time in history, the peasant held the power. The lords who survived the plague woke up one day and looked out over their massive, empty fields. The harvest was rotting on the stalk. Their ploughs were rusting. Their animals were wandering off. A lord's wealth was just land, and land without anyone to work it is just dirt. It's worthless. The peasants who survived, they knew this. They weren't stupid. They saw the empty fields. They saw the desperate lords. And they did something revolutionary. They started to make demands. It would start simply. A peasant would go to his lord and say, "You know all that free work I'm supposed to do for you every week? I'm not doing it anymore. You want this field harvested? You're going to pay me. In cash. And I want double what you paid last year." The lord would be furious. "How dare you? You are bound to this soil. I'll throw you in the stocks. I'll fine you." And the peasant would just shrug and pick up his tools. Fine. And he'd walk off the manor, because he knew that the lord of the next village over, who had also lost half his workforce, would not only hire him on the spot but would probably pay him more and give him a better strip of land. This was unthinkable. It was a total breakdown of the social order. The peasants were negotiating. They were refusing work. They were abandoning their ancestral land, the the land they were legally bound to become, essentially, free agent farm workers, selling their labor to the highest bidder. Serfdom, the very foundation of feudalism, was crumbling in real time. The ruling classes panicked. They saw their entire world, their entire source of wealth and power, dissolving before their very eyes. So they did what powerful people always do when they're losing control. They tried to make it illegal. In England, in 1351, they passed the Ordinance of Labourers. This law is one of the most fascinating documents of the era. It was, essentially, a nationwide wage freeze. It made it a crime for a peasant to demand or be paid more than the wages they were getting before the plague. It made it a crime for a lord to offer more money to try and poach another lord's workers. And it made it a crime for any able-bodied peasant without land to refuse work if it was offered to them at the legal, pre-plague, price. It was, in short, a desperate last-ditch attempt to stuff the genie back in the bottle, to pretend the plague had never happened and that the lords were still in charge. And it failed. Spectacularly. You can't legislate away supply and demand. The peasants just ignored it. They kept demanding more, and the lords, desperate to save their own harvests, kept secretly paying them more. We have court records showing peasants being fined for excessive wage-taking, and then the very next week, they're back at work, earning the same illegal wage. The lords would rather pay the fine and the high wage than let their entire estate collapse. This new, crazy, upside-down world had a profound psychological impact too. For those who survived, there was this new live-for-today mentality. If God, or fate, could wipe out half the world in an instant for no discernible reason, then what was the point of, well, anything? What was the point of following all the rules? What was the point of quietly accepting your place in life? This new attitude was dangerous. It was defiant, and it caused a massive crisis of faith. The church had taught for 1,000 years that suffering was a punishment for sin, but the plague didn't care. It took the pious and the wicked. It took the newborn baby and the holy priest just as fast as it took the thief and the drunkard. The church had no answers. It had no protection. Their prayers, their holy water, their processions, none of it had worked. For the first time, peasants began to question the authority of the church, which had seemed as absolute and unchangeable as the seasons. So, picture the scene. It's 1380, about 30 years after the first Great Plague. You have a new generation of peasants who were born into this new world. They've never known the total submission of their grandparents. They've grown up in a world where their labor is valuable. They're earning real money for the first time. They're dressing in better clothes, which, by the way, the nobles also tried to make illegal. They're eating better food. They are, for the first time in history, feeling a sense of their own power. And at the same time, you have the old guard, the lords, the nobles, the church seething. They are furious. They are trying to claw back every bit of control they've lost. They're passing new laws, inventing new taxes, and trying desperately to force the peasants back into serfdom. You have a newly empowered, defiant, and angry peasant class. And you have a terrified, furious, and stubborn ruling class. It was a powder keg, and it was about to explode. That powder keg we just talked about? In England, the match was lit in the year 1381. What happened next is one of the most dramatic, terrifying, and weirdly inspiring events in all of medieval history. It's known as the Peasants' Revolt. So, you have this incredibly tense situation. The lords and the government are desperate to regain control, and the peasants are not willing to give up their newfound freedom and higher wages. The king, Richard II, who was just a 4-year-old kid at the time, and his government were also broke. They'd been fighting a long, expensive war with France, the 100 Years' War, and they needed cash. Badly. So, what did they do? They decided to levy a new, brutal tax. It was called the poll tax, and it was a terrible idea. Here's why. Most taxes were based on property. You owned more land, you paid more tax. But the poll tax was a flat fee. It was 1 groat, a silver coin, for every single person over the age of 15. Whether you were a rich duke or a dirt-poor peasant with 6 kids, you paid the exact same amount. To a peasant family, this wasn't just unfair, it was an absolute catastrophe. It was an amount of money they simply did not have. It was the final straw. It was the government basically saying, "We know you just survived the apocalypse. We know you're finally earning a decent wage, and now we're going to take it all away from you to pay for our stupid war." In May of 1381, a tax collector named Thomas Bampton rode into a little village in Essex called Fobbing. He demanded they pay this new poll tax. The villagers, led by a local baker, basically told him to go to hell. They said, "We're not paying." Bampton, furious, ordered his soldiers to arrest them, and the villagers fought back. They grabbed their farm tools, their pitchforks, their axes, their scythes, and they chased the armed tax collector and his soldiers out of town. This was it. This was the spark. Word of what happened in Fobbing spread like wildfire. They did it. They fought back. They refused to pay. And all across the southeast of England, village after village just exploded. Peasants grabbed their tools, they pulled their local priests, who were often just as poor and angry as they were, out of the churches, and they started to march. Their first targets? The local lords and the local monasteries. They stormed the manor houses, not just to steal things, but to destroy the evidence of their servitude. They broke into the manor's record rooms and pulled out all the ancient scrolls, the court records, the debt ledgers, the documents that said who was bound to the soil. They piled them up in the village green and set them on fire. They were literally burning their own history. They were trying to erase the feudal system from existence. And they had leaders. One was a charismatic, educated, and extremely radical priest named John Ball. He had been thrown in prison multiple times by the church for preaching dangerous ideas like, "All men are created equal." He famously preached a sermon to the growing rebel army with the rhyming couplet, "When Adam delved, dug, and Eve span spun, who was then the gentleman?" Think about that. He was saying, back in the Garden of Eden, we were all just workers. There were no lords. There were no nobles. This whole system is a lie that was invented by rich people to oppress you. This was mind-blowingly radical for the 14th century. The other main leader was a guy named Wat Tyler. We don't know a lot about him, but he was clearly a natural leader, a brilliant organizer, and full of rage. He and John Ball, who the rebels broke out of prison, managed to organize this chaotic, furious mob of tens of thousands of people into a coordinated army. And they decided to march on London. This wasn't just a riot anymore. This was a full-blown revolution. An army of 60,000 angry peasants and artisans marched on the capital city. The city guards, seeing this terrifying horde, panicked and let them in. For a few days, London was theirs. It was chaos. They hunted down and beheaded the Archbishop of Canterbury, who they blamed for the tax. They beheaded the king's treasurer. They threw them off London Bridge. They burned down the Savoy Palace, the magnificent home of the king's uncle, John of Gaunt, who was the most hated man in England. They weren't just looting, they were making a statement. They were systematically destroying the symbols of the government they despised. This is where the 4-year-old king, Richard II, comes in. He and his court were hiding in the Tower of London, absolutely terrified, watching the city burn. He knew he had to do something, so he did one of the bravest, or craziest, things a king has ever done. He agreed to meet the rebel army, in person, at a place called Mile End. Picture the scene. A 4-year-old boy, king with just a few knights, riding out to face a furious mob of 60,000 men armed with axes, scythes and hammers, fresh from burning down half the city. Wat Tyler rode up to the king and presented their demands. And their demands were stunning. They demanded the complete abolition of serfdom. No man should ever be bound to the soil again. A full pardon for everyone involved in the rebellion. The end of the poll tax forever. Cheap, fixed rent for land. These weren't just demands. This was a blueprint for a new society. And the king said yes. He agreed to everything. He gave them a royal charter. The peasants couldn't believe it. They'd won. A huge chunk of the army, cheering and celebrating, took their pardon and started the march home. They had won. They had ended feudalism. Except it was all a lie. The next day, the king requested another meeting, this time at a place called Smithfield, to meet with Wat Tyler and the remaining hardcore rebels. Tyler, full of confidence, rode up to the king. And this is where the accounts get fuzzy. Some say Tyler was arrogant, that he spit on the ground in front of the king. Others say it was a trap from the beginning. What we do know is that one of the king's men, the mayor of London, suddenly yelled that Tyler was being disrespectful. He pulled out a dagger and stabbed Wat Tyler in the neck. Tyler, bleeding, turned his horse to ride back to his army, but another of the king's knights chased him down and ran him through with a sword, killing him in front of everyone. The rebel army watched their leader be cut down. You can imagine the silence, the horror, then the rage. They all raised their weapons, their bows, their axes. This was it. They were about to kill the king. That one 4-year-old boy, his main protector dead on the ground, was about to be torn to pieces by 20,000 enraged rebels. And in that moment, Richard II did the single most incredible thing of his entire life. Instead of panicking, instead of running, he spurred his horse forward, alone, right towards the rebel army. He rode up to the front line and shouted, "Sirs, will you shoot your king? I am your captain, I am your leader, follow me." It was so bold, so insane, so completely unexpected, that it worked. The peasants, stunned into obedience by centuries of being told the king was God's anointed, just lowered their weapons. They were confused. Their leader was dead, and the king was telling them he was their leader now. Richard calmly led them out of the city, and the army just dissolved. The revolt was over. The aftermath was brutal. As soon as the peasant armies had dispersed, the king tore up the charters he had signed. "Serfs you are," he supposedly said, "and serfs you shall remain." He sent his armies out into the countryside to hunt down every rebel they could find. John Ball, the radical priest, was captured. He was hanged, drawn and quartered, and his head was stuck on a pike on London Bridge as a warning. Thousands of peasants were executed. The rebellion was crushed, completely and utterly. So, you might be thinking, what was the point? They failed. They all died, and nothing changed. But that's not true. The lords and the government had looked into the abyss. They had seen what the peasants were capable of. They had seen an army of 60,000 farmers burn the capital and execute the most powerful men in the kingdom. They were terrified. Officially, serfdom remained the law. But unofficially, in practice, the lords stopped trying to enforce it. They never ever tried to levy a poll tax again. Not for another 600 years anyway. They quietly kept paying the high wages. They quietly let peasants buy their freedom, or leave the manor. The revolt had failed, but the revolution had worked. Within 100 years of the peasants' revolt, serfdom, that system of being bound to the soil that had defined life for 1,000 years, was effectively dead in England. The peasants had lost the battle, but in the long run they had won the war. Their world, the one we've been exploring, was truly, finally, coming to an end. But what replaced it? And what about the legacy of these incredibly tough, resilient, and rebellious people? So, the revolt was crushed. Wat Tyler's head was on a pike. John Ball was executed in the most brutal way imaginable, and the king had gone back on every single promise he'd made. On paper, it was a total, crushing defeat. You'd be forgiven for thinking that this was it, the end of the story, with the peasants right back where they started, in the mud, under the thumb of their lords. But that's not what happened. Not by a long shot. The lords and the king might have won the battle, but they had seen something that terrified them to their very core. They had seen what happens when you push the 90% too far. They had seen tens of thousands of organized, furious farmers with pitchforks and axes burn down the capital city and execute the highest officials in the land. That is a memory that doesn't just fade away. So, while the king said, "Serfs you are, and serfs you shall remain," the reality on the ground was completely different. The government never dared to try a poll tax again. And the lords, while they'd never admit it, were scared. They quietly stopped trying to enforce the old rules. They stopped dragging peasants back to the manor when they tried to leave. They stopped demanding as much free labor. They realized it was just easier and safer to pay the high wages and let the peasants have their freedom. They started leasing out their own land, the domain, for cash rent, rather than trying to farm it themselves with forced labor. Within 100 years of that failed revolt, the system of serfdom, that ancient bond that had tied peasants to the land for 1,000 years, was effectively dead in England. It didn't end with a proclamation or a law. It just withered away. It died a quiet death in thousands of different villages, in thousands of tiny, unrecorded negotiations between a nervous lord and a newly confident peasant. The world we've been talking about this entire time, that classic feudal medieval world, was over. So, what replaced it? What did this new post-plague, post-revolt world look like for the descendants of our peasants? Well, first, life got better. A lot better, surprisingly quickly. With half the population gone, there was suddenly more. More land, more food, more money to go around. The survivors, the children and grandchildren of the plague generation, were living in a world of unprecedented opportunity. Think about it. A peasant family that had once struggled to farm 5 or 10 tiny scattered acres could now take over the empty, abandoned plots of their neighbours. Suddenly, they might be farming 30, 40 or even 50 acres. They weren't just subsistence farming anymore, they were growing a surplus. And with wages high and the price of grain dropping, since there were fewer people to feed, they had something their ancestors had only dreamed of: disposable income. And what did they do with this new money? The same things we do. They bought better stuff. Archaeologists digging in peasant sites from after the Black Death see a dramatic change. They start finding way more pottery, and it's higher quality. They find more metal goods, more tools, more pewter plates instead of wooden bowls, more buckles and buttons for their clothes. Speaking of clothes, they started wearing better ones, made of more expensive cloth and brighter dyes, which, as we mentioned, made the nobles so mad they passed sumptuary laws trying to make it illegal for a peasant to wear certain colours or fabrics. It was the medieval equivalent of, "You can't sit with us." Their diet improved too. With more land and more money, they could afford to eat more meat. They could raise more animals. They weren't just living on gritty bread and pottage anymore. They were eating beef and pork and mutton. Skeletal analysis from this period shows that people were, on average, healthier and taller than their ancestors before the plague. A whole new class of people began to emerge. They weren't peasants in the old sense, and they definitely weren't nobles. They were something new, something in the middle. They were the yeomen. These were the descendants of those savvy survivor peasants. They were families who had saved their money, leased more land, and maybe even bought a few acres of their own. They were tough, they were independent, they were literate. Education was spreading too, and they answered to no one but the king. These yeoman farmers, with their famous longbows, would become the backbone of the English army and the foundation of a new kind of society. This economic shift changed the entire landscape of the country. Lords, realizing that the old model of farming grain with forced labor was a disaster, did something smart. They looked at all their empty, unprofitable farmland and thought, "You know what? This is too much work. What's easy to take care of and makes a ton of money?" The answer? Sheep. This was the beginning of the great English wool trade. Lords all across the country stopped farming and turned their lands into massive sheep pastures. Why? Because you only need 1 or 2 shepherds to watch a huge flock of sheep. It was the 15th century version of automation, and English wool was the best in the world. It was like liquid gold. This made a lot of people very rich. But it also had a huge unintended consequence. It was the beginning of the enclosure movement. Lords started putting up fences and hedges around land that had always been common land. Land that peasants had used for centuries to graze their own animals, gather firewood and forage. This created a new kind of poverty. While the yeoman farmer with his own land was doing great, what about the peasant who didn't get land? What about the family that had relied on that common land to survive? Now, they had nowhere to graze their cow, nowhere to gather wood. They were, for the first time, truly landless. And so, these landless peasants had only one thing left to sell: their labor. They began to drift away from the villages they'd lived in for generations, heading towards the growing towns and cities, looking for any kind of work. They became weavers in the new wool workshops, or dock workers, or blacksmiths' assistants. This was the birth of a new urban working class. So you see, the old medieval world didn't just end. It transformed. It split into these new competing paths. The old, simple, brutal but stable system of lord and serf was gone. In its place was something much more complicated, much more dynamic, and in some ways, much more modern. It was a world of rich yeoman farmers, landless urban workers, and wool-baron lords. This was the dawn of the early modern age, and it was all set in motion by a microscopic bacterium and a few thousand incredibly brave, incredibly angry peasants who, for one terrifying, glorious summer, decided they'd had enough. But what about the legacy they left behind? I mean, these are just anonymous, illiterate farmers from 700 years ago. Who cares? What did they actually give us besides, I don't know, sheep? Well, it turns out almost everything. So, what is the final legacy of these people? These millions of anonymous, illiterate, mud-covered farmers who lived and died centuries ago. It's easy to dismiss them, right? They're just a footnote in the history books, stuck between the real stories about kings and queens and knights and bishops. They're just the background scenery. But here's the truth. They're not the background scenery. They're the stage. They're the foundation. They're the bedrock that everything else was built on. Without them, there are no castles. There are no cathedrals. There are no knights, no kings, no crusades, no art, no anything. Every single great achievement of the Middle Ages was paid for, quite literally, with the sweat, the grain, and the back-breaking labour of the medieval peasant. They were the engine of the entire world. And their legacy isn't just in the stone walls of old castles. It's everywhere. We are, in ways we don't even realise, still living in the world that they built and shaped. Let's start with the most obvious one, the landscape. If you've ever flown over England or France and looked down at that classic patchwork quilt of fields and villages and hedgerows, they did that. That's not a natural landscape. That is a landscape that was carved and dug and ploughed and managed by 1,000 years of medieval peasants. Those strange lumpy ridge and furrow patterns you can still see in grassy fields. That's the fossilized footprint of their ploughs, left in the earth like a signature. The villages, the way the roads curve, the very placement of the local church and the pub, that's all a map drawn by them. How about farming? We already talked about their genius for crop rotation. But they also helped develop and perfect the heavy-wheeled plough, the one that could turn over the dense, wet, clay soil of northern Europe. This invention alone is what allowed civilization to boom in places like England, France, and Germany. It unlocked millions of acres of fertile land. It's what fed the growing towns, which allowed for trade, which allowed for universities. You get the idea. Every time you eat a piece of bread, you are partaking in a technology that they perfected. What about our language? The English we are speaking right now is in many ways their language. While the nobles and the law courts were all speaking French, after the Norman conquest in 1066, the peasants, they just kept speaking English. They kept their old Anglo-Saxon words for the basics of life. Words like house, bread, cow, work, love, sleep, eat. The fancy words, the words for government, law, and fine dining, like beef instead of cow or pork instead of pig, came from the French-speaking nobles. But the core, the guts, the heart of our language, that is pure peasant. How about our culture? Remember all those festivals? The May Day parties, the harvest celebrations, the Yule logs at Christmas? All those traditions of decorating a tree, of village fairs, of community potlucks, of ghost stories on a dark night, that's their culture. Those are the folk traditions that they kept alive for centuries, passing them down from generation to generation. They're the ones who preserved the old fairy tales, the folk songs, the local legends. That's a direct, unbroken line from their smoky hut to our modern holiday celebrations. Even our legal system owes a huge amount to them. We talked about the manor courts. And yeah, they were run by the Lord. But how did they make decisions? They didn't just rely on the Lord's whim. They had a jury. This jury wasn't made up of nobles. It was made up of 12 law-worthy men from the village. 12 of the peasants' own neighbours and peers. They were the ones who would be asked, who really owns that strip of land? Did his cow really eat her cabbages? What is the actual ancient custom of this village? This is the very, very beginning of the jury system. The idea that you should be judged by a jury of your peers? That idea comes straight from the medieval village green. It's the root of what we call common law based on custom and precedent, not just the arbitrary decree of a ruler. And finally, their biggest legacy, their spirit. The legacy of that 1381 revolt. The idea that if you push people too far, they will fight back. The idea that no one, not even a king or a lord, has the right to just own you. That radical, dangerous idea that John Ball preached. When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman? That idea didn't die when he was executed. It went underground. It popped up again with other peasant reformers. It popped up again in the English Civil War. It popped up again in the French Revolution. It popped up again with the American founders writing, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." That is John Ball's idea, just in fancier language. That core, defiant, democratic spirit, the refusal to just shut up and accept your place, we owe that to the medieval peasant too. So, the next time you're having one of those worst days ever, maybe your Wi-Fi is down, or your coffee is cold, or your boss is a jerk, it's worth taking a second to think about these folks. Think about a 4 a.m. wake-up call to go wrestle a wooden plow in the freezing mud. Think about a dinner of gritty, sandy bread and a soup made from peas and onions for the 30th day in a row. Think about living in a 400 square foot hut that you share with your parents, your 5 kids, and your cow. Think about facing down the Black Death, losing half the people you've ever known, and surviving. And think about having the sheer, unbelievable guts, after all of that, to grab a pitchfork, march 50 miles to London, and look your king in the eye and demand your freedom. These weren't just peasants. They weren't just background characters. They were innovators. They were survivors. They were rebels. And they were, in almost every way that matters, the people who made our modern world. They were tougher, more resilient, and more important than we could ever imagine.